Hi everyone, my name is Alexander Zalivako and I'm the founder of From A to Z law firm. One of the areas of our expertise are sanctions, and in a series of presentations called Sanctions 360 Degrees, we will look into major sanctions economic regimes and the way they affect the lives of private individuals and corporations. Thank you very much for watching. It is a pleasure to present today a brief overview of the UK sanctions regime, which following the exit of the United Kingdom from the European Union became a separate and, at least as far as Europe is concerned, the second most important national regime. We will touch on the following points in this presentation. We will discuss the key elements of the UK legal framework, briefly touch upon main government bodies involved in the administration of the UK sanctions program, discuss the territorial and personal scope of the UK sanctions, and will conclude, as we often do, by way of proposing some classification of the UK sanctions with a view to put this regime in the context of other similar sanctions programs, which we discussed in the series. At the time when the UK was a part of the European Union, the sanctions which were applicable in the UK, like a member state of the European Union, were primarily the EU sanctions, and they had the same application in the United Kingdom and followed the same process of adoption as they currently do in the European Union. Following the decision of the UK to exit European Union, however, the question arose as to the establishment of the legal framework for national sanctions program. And with that objective in mind, the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act was passed in the UK, which serves as the main act, as a statutory basis for the adoptions of the specific sanctions regimes addressing with the situations in different regions of the world or specific issues. Within the framework of this act, which we would call for short SAMLA, a relevant minister is responsible for the adoption of the relevant regulations, and the regulations would be a norm of rules which would in effect set out the details of the sanctions regime. So by drawing a broad comparison with the European Union sanctions program, the regulations would be similar to the EU implementing regulations, whereby specific rules and very detailed rules will be set out by the Secretary of State for the purpose of introducing specific sanctions regime. Various agencies are involved in the UK, like in any other state, in the administration of the sanctions programs. As typically, most of the sanctions will be related to financial sanctions, which would include both asset freezes imposed with respect to individuals and corporations, as well as various restrictions on the finance-related transactions, like investment restrictions, restrictions on the opening of accounts, capital markets restrictions, and other similar restrictions. Then the main body in the UK would be the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation, which is responsible for the administration of the sanctions in the financial matters. And more specifically, this will be the main body which is issuing guidances and clarifications, FAQs with respect to the financial sanctions, has a block specifically dedicated to this matter, as well as is taking enforcement actions and is issuing general and individual licenses in connection with the exemptions which are available under various sanctions regulations. The Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office is responsible for the international sanctions politics of the UK, as well as for issuing guidances for the implementation of sanctions. Guidances are similar to OFAC sanctions brochures. They set the general overview of the sanctions regime and serve as a helpful starting point for their analysis. And in accordance with SAMLA, such guidances have to be issued in connection with each sanctions program of the United Kingdom. Other agencies which are involved in the administration of sanctions are set out on the slide, out of which probably I would draw attention to the Export Joint Control Unit and Office of Trade Sanctions Implementation, which would be the agencies responsible for example, issuing licenses for restrictions with respect to trade, as well as National Crime Agency, which will be dealing with the criminal enforcement of the UK sanctions. An important point to consider is the territorial aspects of the application of the sanctions, which would be typically the starting point of every analysis, whether the relevant sanctions program is relevant for a specific transaction or a specific business. In this sense, broadly, the UK approach may be compared to the approach of the European Union, where the connection with the UK jurisdiction is required for the UK sanctions to apply. And this connection can be in the form of the territorial connection, whereby a specific activity comes within the territory of the UK. For example, payments are processed in pounds, then the relevant payment, even if initiated by the payer and payees located outside of the United Kingdom, will fall within the UK sanctions regime, or goods emanating from the UK, which are subsequently resold, again would be subject to the UK sanctions regime, regardless of the actual location of the seller and the buyer, or a personal connection with the UK in a way that a person who is the UK national or a UK company has to ensure that the sanctions regimes are observed by them worldwide. With this in mind, in principle, to the extent the relevant transaction or the relevant business activity has no connection with the UK, either in a form of territorial connection or in a form of personal connection, it falls outside of the UK sanctions and they do not need to be considered. Having said this, one shall always keep in mind of the matters which may inadvertently bring the relevant transactions or relevant business activities within the UK jurisdiction. Some of those examples are given here on the slide. Most relevant, they certainly will be for the UK subsidiaries located outside of the UK, which technically will not be considered the UK companies. They enjoy separate legal personality, but certainly in a bigger international group, there would be certain cross-application of services, persons serving on the boards, both in the subsidiaries and in the parent companies, nationals being employed by the subsidiaries abroad, which all results in the fact that although technically the offshore subsidiary will not be subject to the UK sanctions, this general legal statement may not be as simple in the day-to-day business, which may in effect determine the opposite approach, whereby the UK subsidiary, even incorporated outside of the UK, will need to be following the UK sanctions on a day-to-day basis. For those corporate groups which have presence in the UK, either in the form of subsidiaries or in the form of business partners operating in the UK, this analysis may require very careful consideration to which extent those lines of business affect the overall economic operations of the group and may also result in the UK sanctions being relevant for the business. So the bottom line is that the analysis is not as straightforward as it may sound at first sight, and a very careful fact-to-fact check has to be done in each specific situation, especially taking into account a very important role which the UK plays in the financial markets, financial services, insurance services in the Europe in general, and the application which those services may have on inadvertently, for example, in the form of reinsurance on various commercial transactions. Currently, UK operates more than 30 regimes. These are mostly historical legacies of the previously existing regimes operated at the level of the European Union, which following the Brexit, UK had to adopt in its national laws by way of corresponding regulations. Those regimes are again summarized at the link indicated on this website, where you can see the relevant description of the regime and the guidelines issued with respect to each of those regimes. And the guidelines are useful, as I mentioned. They are comparable to OFAC sanctions brochures, and is a very useful starting point, giving the general overview of the scope of the regimes, the major restrictions which have been introduced, and the main points of concerns, as well as they have often practical examples which can be a very useful starting point for the analysis of whether the relevant sanctions are relevant for your day-to-day business and operations. Looking at the UK sanctions in perspective of their classification and diversity, certainly as of today, one may say that they represent a replica of the EU sanctions. However, significant divergence has occurred within certain regimes. Most noteworthy will be the UK Russia sanctions regulations, which were originally adopted as a replica of the relevant regulations of the European Union, mainly Regulation 269 and Regulation 833, representing the blocking and sectoral sanctions against Russia. However, since the time of the adoption of the regulation, many events occurred, and this resulted in the substantial divergence from the relevant European Union regulations. So although the knowledge and familiarity with the EU sanctions helps considerably with the UK sanctions analysis, certainly one does not exclude the other, and one has to often very carefully peruse and understand the relevant EU sanctions regulations. But as in principle, they follow the EU sanctions, same principle apply. Typically, the lean is towards the targeted sanctions rather than comprehensive embargoes. Within the targeted sanctions, we have two sets of targeted sanctions: asset freezes and prohibitions to make economic resources available to specific individuals and companies. That would be the first category of targeted sanctions. And then the second category of targeted sanctions will restrict certain trade or finance transactions. And there you will have the whole range of relevant restrictions, starting from restrictions related to the capital markets access, issuance of various debt securities or investment in securities, ending up with the multiple trade restrictions related to various items of engineering, commodities, various export and import items, very, very detailed nomenclature, specifically with respect to those regimes which relate to Russia in particular. This is the overview of the UK sanctions. I hope that you found this short presentation useful, and should you have any questions, please be free to contact us.